Hey there guys, today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking every single mini PC that I own and we're going to be putting them through a battle royale in the brand new Cinebench 2024. This is an updated pipeline for Cinebench, so the rendering itself is vastly different this time around, and it really seems to push these little systems to their absolute limit. So we're going to be taking a look at how a bunch of these do on there. So first up to bat, we have the Trigkey Speed S5 mini PC here. This is rocking a Ryzen 5 5500U with 16 gigabytes of RAM running at 3200 mega transfers, and it comes with a 512 gigabyte SSD. Alright, so taking a look at its actual score, in terms of the multi-core performance, we're looking at a score of 427. Just as a comparison, included with Cinebench 2024, the i7-1280p is getting a score of 433. Now, we don't know the exact TDP that is configured to, but the 5500U in this specific system is configured to 25 watts, and it's just shy of getting a score equal to that 12th gen i7. In terms of single core performance, it doesn't necessarily fare that well here, where now instead of being comparable to the i7 12th gen, we're looking at a score that is now of 68, which puts it more in line with the i9 9880H. This is of course getting a score of 70. So not exactly impressive single core performance, but still decent enough multi-core. Next up, we do have the GMKtech NookBox KB2 Max. This is rocking an i5-11320H. This system does have a stock TDP of 45 watts. Now, this being an 11th gen Intel processor, you should expect pretty disappointing multi-core performance, and that is exactly what we end up getting with a score of 337. Not exactly remarkable overall, especially when we compare it to the 5500U here, but where it really shines is in its single core performance, where we actually end up getting a score of 84, one of the highest of any of the systems that I personally tested. Next up, we do have the Magician AM06 Pro. This is rocking a Ryzen 5 5600U, but this does have a stock TDP of 15 watts in comparison to the 25 watt Speed S5. So we're talking about one newer generation in terms of CPU difference, but one is running at 25 watts. This one is running at 15 watts. You can't configure that in the BIOS, but the chassis itself will start to overheat very quickly past those 15 watts. Now, this system was a very interesting one to test out because of the fact that it is rocking a Ryzen 5 5600U. It puts it on paper better than the 5500U or the 5560U that will be coming up. But because this is only limited to 15 watts instead of the 25 watts of both of the other systems, we actually get some pretty interesting performance numbers. In terms of the multi-core performance, we see pretty much the worst of all of the systems tested here with a score of 330 and a single core score of 80. So decent enough, but definitely not remarkable numbers whatsoever in terms of multi-core, though the single core performance really does not seem to have been much affected at all. Now, continuing on where the real battle is, being in the around $200 to $350 price range, here we have the Beelink SER5, but with the Ryzen 5 5560U. This is a 6-core 12-thread CPU, but a very interesting iGPU configuration since it's only the Ryzen, or rather the Radeon 6, so only 6 cores. Now, depending on the exact system that you get, the 5560U might come configured with either a stock TDP of 15 watts or 25. In particular, this system has one of 25, so that's what we tested it on, and with that TDP, we actually ended up getting a multi-core score of 458, with single-core performance at 77. Overall, not too bad performance numbers, especially considering that it is still a extremely quiet system. Of course, continuing on in the SER5 family, we have the version with the Ryzen 5 5600H. This is, of course, a 6-core 12-thread CPU. This time around is rocking a Radeon 7 with a higher clock speed than the 5560U and an overall higher TDP. So what makes the 5600H a more interesting system in comparison to the 5560U is the fact that you get a higher TDP, a more complete version of the Zen 3 architecture, and you get a Radeon 7 instead of a Radeon 6 iGPU. But the overall performance uplift of the higher TDP in terms of the CPU, honestly, not that drastically noticeable. We ended up with a multi-core score of 482 and our single core performance pretty much being an 81. So not exactly massive gains being had here, especially since we're now on a system that is a bit noticeably louder because of that higher TDP requiring more oomph for heat dissipation. Now, rounding off the $250 to $300 price range, we do have the Minisforum UN1245. This is rocking an i5 12450H. This is one of Intel's only high core count inclusions in this comparison. Now, this was one of my first experiences with anything Intel 12th or 13th gen. I have not touched Intel in quite a while now, mostly just due to the fact that they tend to not be at relatively cheap prices. But I was very excited to finally try out a Intel CPU with multiple cores, finally breaking out of that 4-core 8-thread nightmare that we had been stuck on for a very long time. So it was surprising to me to see that this 8-core 12-thread CPU actually performed pretty bad on here. And it ended up giving us a multi-core score of 383, which puts it only slightly ahead of the 11th gen i5 and behind the Ryzen 5 5500U at a TDP of 25 watts instead of 45 watts in comparison to this Intel system. Now, again, Intel does measure TDP differently, so it isn't a one-to-one comparison, but still, that is a pretty massive difference in terms of power here. The only thing that performed worse than it was actually the 15-watt version of the Ryzen 5 5600U, but that is at 15 watts versus the 45 watts that we have available to this system. This is what a very consistent problem here, so it really seems like Intel needs a lot of juice to get some good performance. I'm gonna look more into that. Because if you look at its single core performance, it pretty much tops the charts, at least in terms of the systems that I have available to me right now, with a score of 99. So clearly it's not the individual cores themselves, but it is more than likely the fact that they're not getting enough juice to really give us their maximum performance. So we're going to be messing around with TDP on this system later on. And lastly, I wanted to take a look at two systems that look almost identical to each other, but have very, very different underlying hardware. We have the SER5 Max and the SRE6 with the Ryzen 5 6600H. Both of these very, very interesting CPUs to take a look at because of their advantages and disadvantages. Now, the reason I wanted to take a look at these two systems in particular is because they're very similar to each other in price, but you get drastically different levels of performance. Now, the Ryzen 5 6600H actually ends up giving us a multi-core score of 515, while the Ryzen 7 5800H ends up giving us a multi-core score of 678. Now, there is very little IPC difference between the two of them, even though one is one generation newer. There was no architectural changes done to the CPUs themselves. Really, one of the biggest differences is the fact that the 6600H actually has RDNA 2 for its iGPU, while the 5800H is still on Vega. But if CPU is all that matters to you, the 5800H is holding up pretty well, both of these scoring identically when it came to single core performance, really the biggest difference being in the multi-core. Of course, if the iGPU is more important to you, the 6600H is pretty much going to take a lead in almost every game, but those two extra cores can make the 5800H seem like a far better overall package. Really, I think the biggest takeaways here is the fact that it really seems like all of these chips within this $200 to $250, up until really the $300 to $350 price range, tend to have relatively similar performance. The biggest outliers, of course, being the 8-core Ryzen-based systems, so that being the SER5 Max or the Trigkey with the 5800H, or of course the new SER5 with the 5700U, a system that I am very interested in taking a look at. But of course, if you want to help me get access to these systems, you can become a channel member for as little as $1 a month. That is greatly appreciated. But what I would like to see more of is I would very much like to see Intel in a better showing here. The biggest problem is that a lot of Intel systems tend to be more expensive for what you're getting. This being one of the cheaper systems that I actually found, which is why I was very interested in taking a look at the UN1245. But the i5 in it isn't exactly up to par, especially when it comes to the iGPU in it. And as we saw at the stock TDP, pretty much being held back pretty dramatically. But we're going to be taking a look at that directly in another video. Hope you guys found this interesting. If you did, be sure to subscribe. And again, check out becoming a channel member. It is greatly appreciated. I will catch you guys in the next one.